This video will cover basic concepts of competition from Chapter 12. In class, we will go into a lot more detail in how we go about modeling competition between two species, especially. But I want to talk about some of the general biological concepts of competition so that you have that background before we go into specific details of competition modeling in class. So what is competition? Well, competition is an interaction between two individuals where each of them is going to be harmed by their typically shared use of a limiting resource. So these are what are called minus-minus interactions, where both individuals are harmed by the interactions. Now, competition can be between individuals of a single species or intra-specific, or they could be between members of different species or interspecific. Now, to make things easier for us, we're going to mostly talk about interspecific competition, but intraspecific competition is often what leads to our general logistic growth patterns that we've talked about in the past, and that can lead to carrying capacity, things like that. Whereas interspecific are ones that we're going to focus on more, which are in kind of community level interactions. Okay, so competing for shared use of limiting resources. So what are these things that they're competing for? Well, they could be a variety of things. They are features of the environment that those individuals need for growth or for survival, to be able to reproduce, and they're things that maybe can be consumed or have a limited supply so that not all individuals that want them can get access to them. So they might be things like food. It's a pretty basic resource, so all organisms need a food source. For plants, this could be light. For animals, it might be a prey source. Maybe water in especially terrestrial habitats, so plants compete for water, but animals also compete for water. Could be space, especially for organisms that can't move, so plants or other attached organisms might be competing for space, but it might be space in terms of reproductive grounds or territory space, space for refuge, so good space for hiding from predators. Those might be things that you compete for. So there's many different things, and this is just a small list of things. When two organisms compete, they reduce the availability of the resources. So this is a study that was looking at diatoms. So diatoms are a type of algae that was done in 1980s. And what it showed is that on the left two graphs here, the one with the blue line and the one with the red line on the green line, what they're showing is the blue and the red lines are the growths of those individual species. The green line is the availability of silica. Now, silica is a very important resource for growing the outer structure of a diatom. And so as silica is used up, there becomes less and less resource for growth, and so growth slows. Now, these both show competition within the species as they reach a carrying capacity, as that silica is depleted. On the right, they show that when they compete for silica, one species wins. So the blue one, the blue species, survives and maintains its population size, whereas a red species initially grows but then declines to the point of extinction. So what is going on here? Well, there's a limiting resource, and they're competing for it, and the blue species was able to get access to that resource at the expense of the red species, and the red species lost out in that competition. Another thing you will notice is that they both grew at a slower rate than they would otherwise. So even though the blue species survived, it did not grow as fast as it would have if there was no competition, and we see this as well. So it's minus-minus. They both lose out because of that competition. They're both harmed in some way. If we look a little bit more closely at how individuals of a species compete, they can compete in two different ways. One's called exploitation, and the other one's called interference. Now, exploitation is competition through consumption of a resource. So they're not directly interacting with each other. What they're doing is they're both going after a resource, and they're trying to use up the resource, and by the resource being used up, that leads to depletion of that resource over time, which harms the other species. So whichever one is better at gathering the resource or using the resource is the one that's going to win it out in that competition. Interference competition, on the other hand, is much more direct. It's where they are physically interacting with each other, maybe fighting, getting in each other's way, in order to, again, gain access to that resource, but they are physically interacting, and that's a more obvious form of competition. So both of these forms of competition, exploitation and interference, can happen within a species or between species, and this graphic shows examples of both of those things within species of caterpillar, for instance, or between a caterpillar and a beetle, or a caterpillar and an aphid. So here's just some examples of exploitation and interference competition. So exploitation, so plants, for instance, might compete for water. So they are going to grow roots, and whoever gets to that water source faster gets access to the water, and the other individuals lose out because they can't get access to the water. Fly maggots compete for food, so they eat as fast as they possibly can, and once the mouse carcass is gone, individuals that didn't consume enough to survive will die, and individuals that consumed fast enough will survive. So you might think about this as you competing with your brothers and sisters, perhaps at the dinner table. The person that can eat the fastest gets the most food. That might be an example of exploitation competition. And then on the right, the same kind of thing for herbivorous insects co-occurring on a host plant. They're trying to eat as fast as possible to get to that resource. An example of interference competition in animals, here's acorn barnacles. Acorn barnacles will actually grow on top of other barnacles or other species, and as they do that, they will crush them or smother them. They'll prevent them from eating, and so they do that to exclude them from the location, which is a rocky intertidal zone, and give themselves more room to spread out. And so they actually will directly interact and interfere with the function of another individual. This also happens in plants. Here's an example of kudzu. They grow on top, over and on, completely covering other species and reducing their access to light. They do this in order to get better access to light themselves, but as a result, they will often kill off other species because the other species get shaded and are not able to photosynthesize. Okay. So, whether it's interference or exploitation competition, what we see is that if two species are using the same resource or have the exact same requirements, one is going to be better at competing for them. Either they're going to gather the resources more quickly, or they are going to be able to physically outcompete with the other species, and so only one will end up surviving. They really cannot coexist in exactly the same habitat. Now, looking out in nature, this sometimes seems confusing because you might notice two species, like these two species of squirrel, red squirrels and gray squirrels, that seem to be using resources in the same way, that seem to be growing in the same habitat. But when we look more closely at them, when they are living in the same space, they're not actually using the same resource. So red squirrels, although they'll eat whatever they can get their hands on, they prefer hazelnuts, and they are better competitors for hazelnuts. And so areas where there are hazelnut trees, they will survive very well. Gray squirrels, on the other hand, prefer acorns. So where there are oak trees producing acorns, they are able to survive really well. Now, if there's an area with both of these trees, you may see both of these species because they are superior competitors for their preferred food source, and they'll be able to both survive. If there's only one of these species of tree, then the squirrel who specializes on it will be able to outcompete the other one. And so in some parts of the world you'll see only red squirrels, some parts you'll see only gray squirrels, but there are other parts where you'll see both. Here's another example of species specializing. So these, and we'll talk in more detail about these in class, but birds have different beak sizes, and those beak sizes allow them to be superior competitors for certain types of food. So for instance, this one species of bird, Fugulinosa, eats really small seeds and has a small beak. Fortis has a medium beak and eats medium seeds. And Magnarosis has a large beak and eats large seeds. Now, they're each very specialized and have very high fitness for their particular seeds. Now, they can survive together as long as there are those three different food sources, although if only one of them was in that area, they would eat outside of their preferred food size. They will specialize when they're all growing together. And we'll talk about this thing called character displacement that happens when you have multiple species a little bit later. Okay. So we talked in a previous chapter about niches and niche interactions. Competition will restrict species to what's called their realized niche. And remember, realized versus fundamental. So fundamental is where they could live. Realized is where they actually live. So really, really strong competition prevents them from being in certain or feeding on certain things that they might be able to feed on without the competition. With competition, they'll be localized to their realized niche. Now, competition can also drive evolutionary response to the competitor. And this leads to changes in their fundamental niche, so changes in where they could survive, and maybe broadens out their realized niche a little bit. This is what's called character displacement. So take, for instance, this graph on the bottom left. So these are two organisms, species 1 and species 2, so two different species, and the size of prey that they feed upon. Now, they both feed on a variety of prey sizes, from small to large. Species 1 is able to feed on prey that are a little bit smaller than species 2, and species 2 is able to feed on prey that are a little bit larger than species 1. Because of this, although they could all both eat medium-sized prey, species 2 is likely a better competitor for larger prey, and species 1 is likely a better competitor for smaller prey. Since competition is harmful, individuals that are feeding within that overlap are going to be harmed by that interaction, and that harm might actually lead to them having fewer offspring. So individuals at the extremes, so the lower end of species 1 and the higher end of species 2, are going to likely have more offspring. And over time, what this does is it causes species 1 to become less similar, so more dissimilar from species 2. And they'll end up spreading out in terms of the prey that they feed upon. And if you look at the graph on the right, you'll see that since you have more individuals in species 1 surviving, feeding on small prey, and more individuals surviving and reproducing feeding on large prey in species 2, you end up with this separation. And there's less and less overlap and less competition. Now, competition harms both of them, so it shouldn't be surprising that competing individuals are worse off in terms of reproductive success than individuals that do not compete. And here's another study that shows this on a scale of 3 different species. This is, again, the Fortis, Fugulinosa, and Magnestrosis finches. They are found on different islands, and here's some examples of islands that they're found on. Here's on Los Hermanos Island, there's only Fugulinosa, and its beak is maybe 9 to 11 millimeters in depth. On Daphne Island, there's only Fortis, and it also has about a 9 to, in this case, maybe 12 millimeter beak size. When, however, Fugulinosa and Fortis are found on the same island, which is found in several islands, they show character displacement. Fugulinosa has a relatively shorter beak, and Fortis has a larger beak. So they have competed at that neutral beak size, and that's caused a decline in birds that had the 9 to 11 millimeter beak, and they've specialized, essentially. When you add in a third species, it causes even more specialization, as Magnestrosis has a large beak and takes over the larger size seeds. So you'll see this displacement. Interestingly, when you have environmental events occur, like what happened in 1977 on Daphne Island, where large numbers of finches are will die. So if that competitive species dies off, the mean beak size of the ones that survived might actually change. And so they can go back to the beak sizes that were found without that competition. However, in 1982, when a larger bird colonized that island, the beak size declined. And so competition will drive this character displacement, and you'll get specialization more often occurring when competition exists. So again, competition can lead to evolutionary changes. Now again, we're going to talk more in class about specifics of competition and specifics of competition modeling and determining which species wins out in the competition. But these were just some general concepts to talk about why species compete and what competing species might end up experiencing, and how that might end up changing the population distribution.